about the progress of relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Differences with Washington became increasingly clear. It was the most serious attack ever on Cuban soil. On March 4th, a French freighter laden with ammunition exploded. The weapons were bought from Belgium. 80 people lost their lives. Fidel Castro accused the United States, which immediately denied responsibility. 2 weeks later, Eisenhower approved a secret plan to overthrow Castro. There was widespread speculation about the United States' hostility towards the harsh methods used by the Cuban Revolution. These images fueled the Cuban anti-Americanism, and Fidel took advantage of the situation to justify his policy. Cuba assumed the image of the victim, and gradually, in the name of national security, the revolution changed face. The Americans radically reduced sugar imports, which provoked a reconciliation with the Soviets. On October 19th, the United States imposed a trade embargo against the island. 3 days after the announcement of the American embargo, Che Guevara left for his first journey to the communist bloc countries. He had to assure the sale of Cuban sugar and to obtain credit for the construction of new factories. In China, he was welcomed with full honors. On the airport runway, Vice President Zhou Enlai received him. But it was in the Soviet Union that Guevara stopped the longest. He visited Moscow, Leningrad, and even found time for some sightseeing. He met an infinite number of people, soldiers and workers. He watched a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. He met Nikita Khrushchev. He was even invited onto the Presidium balcony in Red Square to admire the military parade on November 7th. In the meantime, the atmosphere in Cuba had changed. The state now controlled banks, education, transport, industry, and agriculture. The humanist face of the revolution had become tougher, and well-off Cubans left the country. The anti-Castrist front widened. Opponents of the revolution reorganized. Old soldiers of the Batista dictatorship, landowners and rebel officials of the army. In all, there were 3,000 men. Officially, they were all United States agents. On April 15th, the CIA bombed the airports in Havana and Santiago. 7 people died. The already meager Cuban aviation lost 5 aircraft. It was a time of plots to assassinate Castro, attempts to subvert the new Cuban power with the support of the CIA, and the disastrous expedition to the Bay of Pigs endorsed by the new president, John F. Kennedy. In Havana, heavy artillery was positioned along the Malethon seafront, while 35,000 people were accused of hostile acts against the regime and were detained by the police and revolutionary defense committees. The CIA was hoping that an anti-Castrist insurrection would favor invasion. It didn't turn out that way. August 1961. At Punta del Este in Uruguay, a conference of the Organization of American States was held, and Guevara did everything he could to be noticed. He sent a message to President Kennedy via American journalists. Thanks for Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. Before the invasion, the revolution was shaky. Now it's stronger than ever. The United States delegation head's speech was vague and without substance. Guevara had brought the Cold War to Uruguay and attacked the United States.
Lo que hemos denunciado desde hace tiempo y se medite sobre la responsabilidad internacional que tiene el gobierno de un país que autoriza y facilita el entrenamiento de mercenarios para atacar a Cuba.
The reference to plots financed by the United States was crystal clear, and the consequences were just around the corner. America stopped all aid to countries maintaining relations with Cuba, and several months later the Organization of American States expelled Cuba. In the meantime, another of Guevara's battles began. He promoted the creation of a new socialist man role model. He called it the New Man, an unselfish and solid figure prepared to give everything for the community. As a demonstration, he launched the volunteer work experiment.
El trabajo voluntario es una escuela creadora de conciencia. Es el esfuerzo realizado en la sociedad y para la sociedad como aporte individual y colectivo, y va formando esa alta conciencia que nos permite acelerar el proceso del tránsito hacia el comunismo.
After the Bay of Pigs, Castro was convinced that the United States was preparing to invade Cuba, and he asked Moscow for military protection. Whose idea was it to install nuclear missiles on the island? Castro's or Khrushchev's? The Cubans said it was the Soviets, and vice versa. Che began to realize that the Soviet Union was a country full of defects, and he felt increasingly frustrated in dealing with them. He wanted to build a steelworks in Cuba. He wanted the Soviets to help Cuba develop the spirit of socialist egalitarianism and solidarity among comrades. He wanted to be supported in his idea of creating the new man, the true communist, and he wanted Cuba to be free at last. He failed to accomplish any of these things, and a conflict arose between Che Guevara and the orthodox Cuban communists that backed Moscow. October 1962. In Cuban waters there was the threat of another world war. It was the missile crisis, and the Castro revolution realized it was a pawn in a very big chess game. For Guevara, it was the sign that something had changed. His initial enthusiasm for the Soviet model had faded. His economic objectives never took off. With his idea of a new socialist man, he was considered utopian. He no longer felt indispensable in Cuba. Guevara felt that the need to return to the battlefield of the worldwide revolution was stronger than ever. On December 11th, 1964, the Cuban revolutionary was in New York, representing Cuba at the United Nations General Assembly. Cuban exiles welcomed him with extremely violent protests. Guevara had arrived to announce another campaign of revolutionary battles, and the tenor of his words left no doubts.
Mediante la lucha revolucionaria, la esperanza de un mundo mejor, la imagen por la cual vale la pena arriesgar la vida, sacrificarse hasta la muerte en los campos de batalla de todos los continentes del mundo.
February 25th, 1965. In Algiers, he spoke about the Third World. He made a very harsh speech. He accused socialist superpowers, China and the Soviet Union, of applying principles of capitalism in commercial dealings with developing countries. It was his last public speech.
Vive l'armée nationale populaire. Venceremos.
The development of countries that are at the beginning of their path to liberation must be paid for by socialist countries. Socialism cannot exist without a new fraternal attitude towards humanity. Che was no longer under any illusions. His great challenge was underway. Fiercely determined, he set out to show the world what proletarian internationalism really was. In Cuba, his life seemed to continue as before. Few knew that he was about to leave and that he might never return. In the meantime, Fidel Castro adopted a cautious stance. In public, he talked of pacific coexistence, while in private he said if Che could plant the revolutionary flag somewhere else, he'd leave him free to act. Guevara left several farewell letters. One of these was for Fidel.
Reclaman el concurso de mis modestos esfuerzos. Aquí dejo lo más puro de mis esperanzas de constructor.
I leave here the purest of my hopes as a builder and the dearest of those I hold dear. I carry to new battlefronts the faith that you taught me.
En los nuevos campos de batalla llevaré la fe que me inculcaste, el espíritu revolucionario de mi pueblo, la sensación de cumplir con el más sagrado de los deberes, luchar contra el imperialismo donde quiera que esté. Esto reconforta y cura con creces cualquier desgarradura.
April 1st, 1965. Ernesto Che Guevara left for Africa. 3 weeks later, he reached the Congolese shores of Lake Tanganyika, where he met an unexpected reality. No one has the slightest idea of what a firearm is. They shoot while playing with their weapons or because of carelessness. Disagreements within the anti-government movement stopped Guevara from organizing military action. Weeks, months of inertia followed. After 7 months of almost no fighting and the frustrating impossibility of training the local soldiers, Guevara made a bitter and self-critical analysis. I learned a lot in Congo, and I left with more faith than ever in the guerrilla fight. But we failed. November 22nd, 1965. Che left Congo and secretly returned to Cuba, but his mission to liberate oppressed populations was not over. He soon decided on Bolivia. A military junta had just come to power. Clashes, protests and demonstrations were inflaming the country. The CIA thought he was in hospital in the Soviet Union. With the help of the Cuban secret services, Guevara transformed himself into a middle-class 40-year-old. He wore thick lensed glasses, he was half bald and his eyebrows were thicker. To seem shorter, he took out the insides of the heels on his shoes. With roughly 50 men, he tried to set up a training base. On November 7th, the men built a tunnel to hide provisions and materials. Instead of supporting the guerrillas, the Bolivian Communist Party launched a dissuasion campaign. The situation is not good, but a new stage of testing begins for the guerrillas, and it will do us good if we overcome it. Months passed in pursuit of and escaping from the army, which seemed to be everywhere. The comrades' losses became increasingly higher. Che was ill. He could hardly walk. He had lost about a third of his body weight. He was emaciated and famished. He was different, no longer as attentive and cautious as he used to be. August 1967. Increasingly alone, the guerrillas tried to flee northwards. They reached the mountains and apparent safety. September 1967. The town of Valle Grande, in the heart of Bolivia, became the base for the Bolivian Army's anti-guerrilla operations. Commander Guevara moved into the open with few precautions and apparently without a plan. His diary entries at this time are addressed to a later. They seem written by a man aware that he's marching towards his own end. The best bullet of this pistol, which has always accompanied me, the indelible memory of the children that one day you and I conceived, and the fragment of life that remains of me, I give this to the revolution. Nothing which is capable of uniting us can ever have a greater power. September 26th. The guerrillas arrived in the village of La Higuera, a piece of land between two mountains, where there were only women and children. The peasants had fled after being warned of the army's arrival. The guerrillas were ambushed by the army. 3 comrades were killed and 2 wounded. On October 7th, Commander Guevara was optimistic and wrote what was to be the last page in his diary. It has now been 11 months since the start of the guerrilla movement. It's a day without problems, bucolic. There were 17 of them left. That night, Che picked up a Chilean radio station. There were 1,800 Bolivian soldiers looking for them in the mountains. October 8, 1967. Surrounded by 2 companies of Bolivian rangers in the Churro Gorge, Che Guevara was shot in the leg and captured. A bullet had destroyed the cylinder of his rifle, and Che couldn't use his weapon. With arms extended, leaning on 2 soldiers, the most wanted man in the world was led to the village of La Higuera, where he was imprisoned in a school. Che Guevara slept on the floor of the school during the night between the 8th and the 9th of October. His hands and feet were bound. The bodies of his friends lay next to him. October 9th. At 12:30, a radio message from the Bolivian High Command in La Paz read, "Proceed with the elimination of Senor Guevara." The order was signed by the President of the Bolivian military government. A meeting took place to decide what to do with Che Guevara, and it was decided he must die. The order was transmitted in code to CIA agent Feliz Rodriguez. The agent entered the room and said simply to Guevara, "Commander, I'm sorry." Sergeant Mario Terranzi volunteered to carry out the order. It was 10 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. With a semi-automatic pistol, he fired at Che's arms, legs, then chest. It was October 9th, 1967. Ernesto Che Guevara was 39 years old. The bullet-riddled body was fastened to a helicopter skid for its final journey. When it arrived at Valle Grande, the eyes were still wide open. The soldiers called a photographer to immortalize the moment. The first journalists and onlookers arrived. Before long, a veritable procession of people had begun. Some of them secretly cut off small locks of his hair as good luck charms. News of his death broke in Cuba. The radio reported that Commander Guevara had died from battle wounds. Fidel Castro was doubtful. He didn't want to believe it. October 15th. Fidel received the photos of Che Guevara's corpse. Now he had proof. The reports were true. In an emotion-filled voice, he addressed the Cuban people and passionately remembered his fallen comrade.
Un modelo de hombre que no pertenece a este tiempo. Un modelo de hombre que pertenece a los tiempos futuros. De corazón digo que ese modelo, sin una sola mancha en su conducta, sin una sola mancha en su actitud, sin una sola mancha en su actuación, ese modelo es el Che. Si queremos saber cómo deseamos que sean nuestros hijos, debemos decir con todo el corazón de vehementes revolucionarios: queremos que sean como el Che.
A nuestro héroe inmortal, a nuestro guerrillero heroico.
30 years after his death in Bolivia, the remains of Che Guevara were returned to Cuba. With the regime rhetoric that he so disliked, the Cuban population paid homage to him. The romantic image of the revolutionary, his face and his words, have become part of popular imagination. Legend has consigned him to history as forever young, forever a rebel. Ernesto Che Guevara conquered death. He knew he would. He knew it the day he said to the soldier who came to kill him, "I know you've come here to kill me. Shoot. You're only killing a man."
Ahora esta masa anónima, esta América de color, sombría, taciturna, que canta en todo el continente con una misma tristeza y desengaño, ahora esta masa es la que empieza a entrar definitivamente en su propia historia, la empieza a escribir con su sangre, la empieza a sufrir y a morir, porque ahora por los campos y las montañas de América, por las faldas de sus sierras, por sus llanuras y sus selvas, entre la soledad o el tráfico de las ciudades, en las costas de los grandes océanos y ríos, se empieza a estremecer este mundo lleno de corazones, con los puños calientes de deseo de morir por lo suyo, de conquistar sus derechos, casi 500 años burlados,
por unos y por otros. Porque esta gran humanidad ha dicho basta y ha echado a andar. Y su marcha de gigantes ya no se detendrá hasta conquistar la verdadera independencia por la que ya han muerto más de una vez inútilmente. Ahora, en todo caso, los que mueran, morirán como los de Cuba, los de Playa Girón, morirán por su única, verdadera e irrenunciable independencia.
Comandante Che Guevara,
seguiremos adelante, como junto a ti seguimos, y con Fidel te decimos, hasta siempre, comandante.
aquí se queda la clara, la entrañable transparencia